So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be continuing with, of course, Surah al-Maida, but it's important to consider a couple things. So, when we're looking at the ayat, let's just zoom out a little bit and into speaking about, of course, the Bani Israel. We went into speaking about what they were saying about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the implication of what shirk that they had committed. And you just keep that in mind. The shirk that they had committed was really in the area where they had attributed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not attribute himself with. So, so that piece of it, I guess, identifying an area of shirk, which is in the names of and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A couple things about, well, what actually makes tawheed. Let's just look at tawheed and what makes tawheed. So you are speaking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his essence being one. That's number one. So basically considering the essence of Allah to worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're looking at the word worship, more comprehensive than ritual, because worship is to include, number one, it's to, sorry about that word. Worship is to, okay, sorry about that. Worship is to include different principles. Okay, so just keep that one in mind. And number three, when we're speaking about the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that would be that all that describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and no one else is just given such names or attributes. And therefore, whether it is to a human idea, keep that in mind. The part about idea, that would be considered shirk. So each and every single one of these is going to be shirk, whether the person denies the essence of God be somehow united with other things, whether we're speaking about perhaps some Ram god or some god that looks like a certain creature, etc. Then in that situation, they had associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, regarded that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is part of something, so or part of someone, or in that situation, we would basically consider that that's shirk or kufr, and because this person did not give the glory to the Lord Almighty and basically gave the description of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to a particular person or an item, etc., had given that item or that thing or whatever it is, given that thing, the description of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we would say that that person committed kufr because they basically regarded that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like a creature. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a creature, that in itself is basically containing the whole, let's call it the whole center and the whole essence of kufr. Okay, or can contain two things. Number one, kufr is to deny. Okay, to deny. There can be a general term where Christians might say about Trinity, and they are kafir about what we would say about Trinity. Okay, so this is the literal term, but more specific to the person denying the glory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether denying his glory in the bounties that he's giving, or whether denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his essence, or whether denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his names and attributes, in other words, in his powers. So when you're looking at the essence, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's essence, one, he exists; two, he exists in one; three, no one shares his existence, no one shares the powers, only one essence of Allah Almighty. But then that's not it, because worship is also included in this. When we're speaking about worship, we're speaking about ritual. We're speaking about even more comprehensive than ritual to include principles. In other words, the understanding of principle. What do you go back to in order to understand or explain the relationship between you and righteousness? So that type, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that has the right to define principle, because your actions are basically given to you or in order to do one particular thing, one purpose, and that purpose, وَمَا خَلَقَتُ, and jinn or man, and basically the jinn, for one reason, which is to be worshippers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, to worship, the test is basically involving a more comprehensive thing than ritual, because we would see in Surah al-Baqarah, for example, when it was telling us وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ of Khalifa, is not like we said, a political position, but it's actually a position of what you carry out in life to create the advancement of society, to create justice, to ground. So that's where, of course, worship is more comprehensive in Islam than ritual. It would include principles as well. For the names and see this is by going back to Ayat al-Kursi. Let's go back to Ayat al-Kursi, even though we had done that before. SubhanAllah, I didn't actually, that was afiq min Allah. I didn't actually prepare this. Okay, here we go. Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. Let's see. Ayat al-Kursi, this is Ayat al-Kursi. You could see in Surah al-Baqarah. Here it is, Surah al-Baqarah. Is probably, I would say, the center and the best center to explain Tawheed. Remember how we did, I guess, the worship, and we also said names and attributes. That's the basis of it. Allahu la ilaha illahu. Allah is basically that word come from. Is it necessarily a conjugated word, or is it a name? Why does that even matter? So that matters because we would basically see that scholars went into a debate whether it from a verb or whether it was in itself a name. In other words, no, it's to describe a deity, and that was basically it. And it wasn't conjugated. They went into debate, a huge, long debate. And you could go back to the debate in the book Al-Lum'ah. And the scholars that said that it goes back to al and aliha, and they considered that the word aliha would basically mean the one that would give affection, the one that would give, the one that is worshipped, the one that is, that al-ilah would be that that defining article, would basically mean he's the one that the people, regardless of their faith, the people, affection, a center for worship, a center for glory, and then therefore that word or ilaha or Elohim or ilah, etc., just the word ilah itself. Okay, and then the al would be that identifying article. The other group of scholars that said that no, this is a noun and not necessarily a verb, and they said the word aliha was basically the root in, I guess, in linguistics, and basically goes to a particular noun and not necessarily conjugated from a certain verb, and therefore regarded that al-ilah is to say the God, the thing that people worshipped, and not necessarily anything that relates to a particular action of what that God does or what that God is for, but it's just a deity, a God that people wanted to worship or worship. So where does the whole concept and the whole idea of God come from? Did we invent the idea of God, or was the idea of God revealed to mankind? So philosophers themselves, Muslim philosophers, but we're talking about non-Muslim philosophers, and of course, Randolph and those different philosophers, some of them would say was something that people invented because it made them feel better, because of course, in Islam, we would say that that's absolutely false, and that the whole idea, the whole concept of God, in other words, the idea was not invented to somehow bring some form of comfort to mankind, that is outside of man's imagination. It is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed in revelation throughout history. So, of course, invented in order to somehow relate to something out there, and in order for us not to feel that we are lonely somehow. So we invented the whole idea of God. So Allah starts out with telling us, well, Allah, the God, the deity himself, the one that basically is the center of glory, creation, is basically Allah. La ilaha illahu. There's no God worthy of worship but he. Well, wait a minute. Why did you say la ilaha, deity, but he? Why did you say that? So the thing is that the Arab at the time, they did actually use the word God, Allah. And so did the Christians, so did the Jews, so did the pagans, all using the word Allah or Elohim. It goes back to the same word. Okay, so even the Arab before the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they actually used the word Allah. They didn't use a different word. They use the word, in of course, within that word, that this is actually talking about a creator. This is talking about a being that we're supposed to turn to. But the Arab, they didn't deny the existence of God. They believe in a number of different things. Number one, they didn't believe that God has any relationship with the people. And in order to worship, or at least to bring about good luck, to bring about a life that was basically reach out to God by worshiping different idols that reminded them of God's essence. So they would create, I guess, in shapes, what each and every single thought that they thought about. Basically, every single idol was, one, worshipped by certain tribes. Number two is that every single idol resembled and commemorated perhaps a certain power, and the list goes on and on. And basically, they would turn to that idol in order to revive some feeling, and then it would be through this idol. So that's what they had done. So they started inventing all of that. And when Islam and the Prophet ﷺ was saying, La ilaha illallah, that there's no God worthy of worship but Allah, the Sallam was telling them that there's only one God, one being, because they already believed that there was one God, because it was to them impossible to regard one God responsible for creation, responsible for provisions, responsible for life, death, and responsible for everything, because they regarded that what would make sense is that every single going to resemble one piece or one side of that power. That's how they had no way that one can be a chief of all of that. So they basically understood things based on what they understood in nature. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they understood that we're talking about worship here, because the ayat themselves were always debating with them, telling them, well, who's the one that created everyone? Who's the one that brings it? And they would say, Allah. Well, if you're recognizing that it's Allah, the God, then why are you turning into worship other deities? So that's where, of course, the whole idea, la ilaha illahu, but it's not enough to know that we're supposed to turn to God into worship. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then breaks down for us the one that we would turn to in worship. Why is he the God? So then breaks it down, al-Hayy al-Qayyum, because he is the one that founded life, and he is the one that does not depend on everything else. If you want to call something God, it has to be the basis and the foundation for life. If life was granted to it, that means it did not make life because it was dependent on others. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala started out with al-Hayy. His existence does not depend on others. If his existence doesn't depend on others, then he is Qayyum. He is self-efficient. How do we understand that something is self-efficient? And how do we explain, and why can't the sun be God? Why itself is losing energy? Well, what does that even mean? So to lose energy is to lose life. To lose energy isn't what started out life. How so? Well, if it originated itself, energy / the source of life, then it would have been capable of sustaining its life to make it eternal. Just the whole eternal actually tells us that there's something else that came before it that made it possible. Sinatun wala nawm. Not sleep, and not to any stage of sleep overcomes the Lord Almighty. What is sleep supposed to really relate to? Is he the main essence of existence? He's basically the essence that precedes all existence. He's the founder of creature. So therefore, recognizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, la ta'khudhuhu sinatun wa la nawm, not only is he the founder of creation, but not any part of weakness overcomes the Lord Almighty. Big. Lahu ma fis samawati wa ma fil ard. To him belongs everything that is in the heavens, everything that you see in everything that is on earth. Man dha alladhi yashfa' indahu illa bi'idhnih. When we're speaking about the different classification of religions into three. One, the first classification of religions is basically the Hathmans that believe that God Almighty sent scripture, and that scripture basically tells us about God, and then we would turn to scripture in order to understand God. The pagan religions, they would consider that God exists, but then the other pagan things, the idols, they would resemble the power of God, whether we're speaking about resemble the power of God Almighty. In other words, they are gods. The Hathic religions, or at least, of course, we're talking about monotheistic religions, let's say it this way, monotheistic religions. But according to the other religions, they would consider, at least the pagan religions, that everything is God's. Then goes the other type of religions, which basically the atheistic religions. Buddhism, those are the atheistic religions, where the whole idea and the concept of God is not there. Different practices, different wisdoms that we're supposed to be connecting with nature. And basically nature, words, it acts as God, even though they don't use the word God, but it acts as the power that we would have. These religions speak about reincarnation, because you would blend with life the foundation of death, the foundation of existence, and therefore you don't go out of it. So very similar to the new atheism, considering that that nature, or at least our existence, is nothing but matter in motion. When we say matter, consider that everything is really matter in motion. It's basically the power of nature that is making everything that surrounds us. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is right there. فَعِنْدَهُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ. So even those that you might consider as somehow, I guess, having some form of relationship with God, no one that can bring about any form of a resemblance to God or have even except whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills. So, okay, how far and what is the most important thing about God? So yes, he's the source of life that doesn't depend on anyone or anything. Number two, يَعْلَمُ مَا بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَمَا خَلْفَهُم. The second thing about he has the knowledge that is between their hands and what is in their back. Well, this isn't between their hands, talking about what's in between your hands literally, but this is actually talking about between your hands to mean your own future and your past. In other words, this is to say that not only is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the founder of existence, but he's also saying, going back to يَعْلُمَ بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَمَا خَلْفَهُم, that the Lord Almighty goes beyond time and space. So when you're looking at لَهُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا, that place, that, of course, that area, that it basically belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, the Lord Almighty is beyond place. In other words, the Lord Almighty, his existence supersedes them. His existence and his knowledge supersedes time. What does that mean? So, يَعْلَمُ مَا بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَمَا خَلْفَهُم are basically things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond, and therefore he is the one to know all of that because he is the Lord Almighty. To the Lord Almighty, inshallah, I'll talk about that. All right. وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. الإحاطة, or يحيطون, basically means to surround. But this isn't talking about surrounding in terms of circumference. But this power overcomes. That's an ihata to mean not the circumference of things, but this power expands and is beyond time. So here we go, beyond time and beyond place. And therefore, he is the one to know all, and therefore to determine the purpose that preceded your existence. The purpose that preceded your existence, and certainly it's also the one, he's also the one to determine what إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. Everything goes within, of course, his will. So now we have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one, the founder and the one that is beyond life only. Number two, he is the one that goes beyond place. Because second that you would say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in somewhere or in something, that's when you had limited Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, well, no, everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you cannot say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is everywhere, because the second you would say Allah's everywhere is that same second that you basically had made Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala become part of a tray, or that believing that God, or well, not agnosticism, but this is basically ittihad, and somehow considering that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes a part of a tray, a part of a, perhaps without us realizing. So that's not agnosticism. Agnosticism is something else. Sorry, confuse that. But you're seeing then in that situation that they had limited Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into, I guess, realization that the Lord Almighty is far more magnificent than place, than time, existence. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَسِعَ كُرْسِيُّهُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. The earth. Did he talk about himself? No, this is just the throne. In other words, are you capable of understanding the magnificence of the Lord Almighty? Giving you at least part of understanding the magnificence of the Lord Almighty. And therefore, he said, just his throne is filling the earth and the space, the earth and the heavens and if he is the one that's basically the Lord that's containing space and place, then who's preserving all? In other words, nothing would basically be a burden on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if we're speaking about beyond place, we're speaking about beyond space, we've got here. Number one, we're speaking about the source of power. We're speaking about beyond knowledge, beyond time. We're speaking about his knowledge exceeding everything that we might know. And we're speaking about his ability to pull and summarizing all that into وَهُوَ الْعَلِيُّ الْعَظِيمُ. And he is Al-Ali. Al-Ali, he is beyond all in place, beyond all in time, beyond all in knowledge, beyond all. He is the one that is magnificent. Going back to that ayah that we were doing, how do we understand how this is relating to the ayah that we were doing? So we're thinking about, of course, when we were doing the part about shirk and the Yahud committing the shirk, they were committing the shirk in misunderstanding, confusing how they would understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and called Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Yadullahi Maghlula. They said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hand, or at least Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's powers in terms of providing provisions, that it's basically limited, that it's worth. And then it continues, and we went into speaking about وَلَوْ أَنَّ أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ آمَنُوا وَاتَّقَوْا لَكَفَّرْنَا عَنْهُمْ سَيِّئَاتِهِمْ, and we went into speaking about, well, another form of what that this shirk and this misunderstanding of God led to them, of course, going into denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power, or even how he would define justice, or even fair distribution ethics. So the implication was that it increased in their tughyan and in their kufr, in their transgression. So it's important to go on with the pattern and see where the ayat are taking us. So the ayat are taking us and telling us, well, if you recognize that misunderstanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had led them to committing tughyan and kufr, and later on it resulted in animosity, resulted in hate, resulted in massive wars that they would basically fuel, and certainly corruption on earth, that was a result of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right. Why? Because the second that we would deny the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what we're going to do, and that we would have to abide by principle at all. Well, that's the same thing with atheism. New atheism, of course, atheists would want religion is what fueled wars throughout history. And they would want to, of course, claim that by somehow believing that there is, I guess, the place of truth, that's basically taking humanity and considering that they are right and therefore denying other people. But here's one thing. Just with the whole idea of presenting themselves as being inclusive, is that they're actually denying that you have the right to exist, and that's why they would mock the religions. That's why they would say religion of war, etc. And of course, they would deny that the World War I and II were actually not fueled or were not founded on religion. An atheist application, an atheist foundation. And how so? Atheists, they just want to say atheist, and we're speaking about right there, can an atheist actually say that there is a morality that we're supposed to adhere to? So for a new atheist, in general, we would say that we would have the general masses of atheists, and those are usually the people that would take atheism more of a rhetoric than actually know the implication of atheism. The implication of atheism basically regarding that man is nothing but matter in motion, and therefore any form of adhering to a certain principle is basically not leading to necessarily justice, because anyways, you're nothing but matter in motion. If you manage to get away and you manage to somehow guess the only challenge is basically getting discovered, but since we're just matter in motion, then therefore morality or justice is all meaningless. In other words, that whole area of subjective morality, there's no morality that we need to turn to. So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that right there, the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or of course it takes us back to the same fine line of denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and going to be resulting in transgression, going to be resulting in injustice, going to be resulting in corruption on earth. Because the second that a person loses that compass in understanding God and believing in God, then they're not going to adhere to a certain particular principle to interpret what their duty is towards life and towards their existence. Then in that situation, they would consider themselves as the center of existence. That would actually mean I just have to work towards not a principle and not necessarily care about other people, but I would just have to care about myself. And that idea in new atheism, existentialism. What is existentialism? Existentialism basically comes, of course, John Paul Sartre basically wanted to say, well, on the inside, we have to have a purpose in life. Before, and if you were to look at John Locke, David Hume, Kant, whatever it is, before the philosophers were purpose behind life. Why are we created? Well, when new atheism started coming in, they said, well, why do we even need to search for a purpose? And make it that, why don't we create a purpose? Before it was searching for the purpose of life, but now it basically with the whole the Sharia of New Atheism. New Atheism basically regards that God doesn't exist, and therefore our life is supposed to be really meaningless, would create their meaning, and therefore it's not searching for truth, but it's making truth. It's not considering a certain area to be the foundation of what is considering that every single person has their definition of right and wrong, which is called relativism. And it's not necessarily supposed to be prove something right and wrong or the logic or how we get into the rationale behind and the evidence. But no, it's all absurd anyways. There's no purpose to life anyway. Is just creating a narrative to support making it look good, at least since there's no foundation. This is the era of postmodernism. And of course, with existentialism, you create the purpose and not necessarily find or search for. Then see the lifestyle that surrounds us is basically going around that. Well, of course, the ayat were not discussing atheists, but the ayat were actually discussing Ahl al-Kitab, which when you're looking at that, how do we understand the implication, faiths and etc.? How do we understand, I guess, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that in order to bring about peace and stability in life, it actually starts with having tawheed in place. If you didn't have your tawheed in place, then you're going to start confusing towards Allah and towards people and towards yourself, because if you have your tawheed as the center, and with the second you put yourself as the center, that's when, of course, your greed basically goes onto the, and justice is basically going to be right there, vanishing little by little, because if it comes the practice of every single individual, and certainly kufr and the loss of tawheed basically gone from one individual after another, the society is all going to be living in an individualist society. What is an individualist society? An individualist society where, right, it's just me that is important here. I'm the center, and therefore, if it's not bringing me any benefit, I shouldn't care about it. If it's not making me live happy, well, it doesn't concern me. That's an individualist society within our societies today. And definitely, what is that going to be? Bring in طغيان, kufr, al-adawa, al-baghdha, and al-harb, and al-fasad on earth. Well, is that the same necessarily? Is this type of interpretation exclusive to the Yahud? Or is this going beyond to other people of the book? So that's where the ayat were continuing with the same paradigm and telling us, well, if the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, had believed, in other words, in the revelation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent, in the final revelation, in the Quran, and if they had applied the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would not aggression, injustice, or animosity, or hatred, or wars, or even corruption on earth. They would have even eliminated perhaps the implication that they would eventually face on Judgment Day. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَكَفَّرْنَا عَنْهُمْ سَيِّئَاتِهِمْ. And even on Judgment Day, Allah hold on, let me just do one thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have even granted them a farther blessing, not only on earth, but a farther blessing to come, which is the implications of their sins, and they would enter Jannah. But let's move on right there. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues. And if they had, the word is aqamu. And we said that the word aqamu comes from the root qama. And when we say qama, we're actually talking about, well, we're talking about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to basically right there they were to put it into practice, if they were to basically support it, if they were to establish it, that's the word. So when you look at the word, I actually prepared a page for us to see in this regards. Oh, I actually erased it. Oh dear. Okay, I'm going to find that for us just to kind of get an idea of the word qama, this page. Let me just show it to you and share it with you. And this is it. What I did, I went into just the word qama, and this is a really good website. Basically would give me the meaning of the Quran just for the word qama, just the word, the root, to all the different ayat. Let's go for the first one and actually see what the word qama actually means in the Quran in its different they stand. In other words, to be still. توقفوا عن السير وبقوا متحيرين. They basically just stand in confusion. So here we go. At least we would know that qama can mean to stand still, to basically be idle in some way. Let's see. Maqam Ibrahim, his feet were centered in. In other words, it's talking about a center. It's talking about a place that is the area where he was standing. And let's see. Aqama salah, a person who applies salah and does it, whether it's on time, whether it's basically the different rulings that relate to salah. So of course you could see that the word qama itself, there's even more. Okay, there's more, but we're just doing pieces of it. The idea, it's a certain place of establishment, it's a certain place of standing, it's a certain place that we would turn to, and therefore الصلاة to base أقاموا التوراة والإنجيل, sorry, not أقاموا الصلاة, أقاموا التوراة والإنجيل, that they would establish what and the Injil and وما أنزل إليهم, and what was revealed onto them from the Quran, basically min rabbihim, from their Lord Almighty. What is that? What is the ayah really trying to get us into? Remember when it told us that what the Yahud were saying, the implication forth, well, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically taking us with the same concept and telling us whether it's the Yahud or whether it's the Christians or whether it's the Muslims themselves, or any group foundation of justice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had defined, then the implication is going to be basically that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, if they had established what was in the Torah or and the Injil and what was in the Quran, they would have actually found لَأَكَلُوا مِنْ فَوْقِهِمْ وَمِنْ تَحْتِ أَرْجُلِهِمْ, had basically gotten, and they would receive an abundant amount of provisions. How do we get there? You want to keep in mind that it is some form of stability. And when we're speaking about stability, we're speaking about economy. Of course, let's say that maldistribution, and certainly that's when politics and military goes to somehow correct that area of maldistribution. Sometimes it's correct, sometimes it's not at someone else's expense. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that when we're speaking about provision is there, but what we would establish what was basically revealed in the revelation, that's the key to basically giving us fair distribution. And in other words, this is to say that establishing the words of the Lord Almighty, the revelation itself was basically going to be ending transgression, ending animosity. In other words, this is taking us into realizing, and that realization that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the main reason why Allah will bring about justice in this dunya and success in the akhirah. منهم أمة مقتصدة. Of course, from them, أمة مقتصدة وكثير منهم ساء ما يعملون. The majority, ساء ما يعملون, certainly majority would actually go on the wrong side. They would apply the wrong themselves, living one, that individualism, that selfishness is their place, to consider that they're the foundation, that everything basically is, they would basically search for different ways for others to work towards them. In other words, it's basically this narcissist lifestyle. Ya ayyuha rasul. So what is the Prophet supposed to be doing? بلغ ما أنزل إليك من ربك. Reveal and proselytize. For if you have not done so, then you had not delivered the message, and the Lord Almighty would protect you. Why would he protect him? Well, because there's going to be a lot of opposition, and certainly many are going to stop and try to challenge and try to eliminate any power that is basically exposing all the different selfish individualists and self-centered, and basically anybody that the revelation is going to be exposing their centricity and exposing their interests in the da'wah. So the Prophet ﷺ was ordered right there, in Allah la yahdi al-qawm al-kafirin, ordered to reveal the message and just recognize that are kafirin. Kafirin, one, that means the people to deny. Two, kafirin, the ones that would be believing that they're the ones that are the foundation of in other words, they don't regard that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the foundation to whatever provision. They would regard themselves as the basis for all good, and therefore whatever, well, it's because I'm smart, it's because I just knew how to do it, it's because I am basically all the problems. That's kufr, that's arrogance, And we talked about arrogance and the basis of loss, the foundation of how many would basically find themselves as the center, and therefore others are supposed to be working for them, and others are basically less privileged, basically not have the same rights. Not having the same rights basically means that they would ones to be the center that everyone is working for. And certainly you could see لا يهدي القوم الكافرين, that Allah this type of denying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the source of their bounties, was the source of their health, was the source of provisions, what blessings they are living in. The second that they deny that is that same second they would be part of al-kafirin, and they would not be capable of finding guidance. قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ, tell them. Now, when you say قُل, it's basically coming at a number of different areas. Number one, Qul is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling the Prophet sallam, say it, tell them the rank. You tell them. In other words, don't wait for them to basically come as a leader and you establish that point and that statement, and don't wait for them to somehow act in arrogance. And this is extremely important, that a Muslim is supposed to Qul, stand up and speak in power. And speak in power. This is not establishing and announcing that you basically are there coming to give them of what they don't know. O Prophet of Allah, you're there. You have to speak in power. قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ لَسْتُمْ عَلَى شَيْءٍ. Speak in power. Speak in confidence. لَسْتُمْ عَلَى شَيْءٍ حَتَّى تُقِيمُوا التَّوْرَاةَ وَالْإِنْجِيلَ وَمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكُمْ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ. Tell them, you're not at any argument until you would basically establish at-Tawrah, the Old Testament, at-Tawrah, al-Injil, what was revealed unto you from the Lord Almighty, that is the Quran. What is that basis that ayah is coming from? Confidence. 2, hierarchy. And most importantly, Allahu Akbar. If you're Muslim, you have to speak in power. If you're Muslim, you have to speak in power, in a form of ilm, authority. You have also the argument and the power to the argument. If that ilm means you learning the language, we'll learn it. If that ilm means you also learning ideas in order to make those debates basically stronger, to support the argument of Islam, well, then that's what you have to do. That's why Ibn Taymiyyah learned, in other words, not well versed in studying well, number one, the religion that they are debating, that it would be haram for them to go into such debates. Why? قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَدْعُو اللَّهَ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ, proselytize, or I would hear, announce, or teach the words and أَدْعُو اللَّهَ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ, with knowledge. Because knowledge is supposed to help you. Knowledge is supposed to help you grow in your understanding and expand basically the flaws within the other people's religions. So what are we doing? وَلَا يَزِيدَنَّ كَثِيرًا مِّنْهُمْ مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ مِنْ رَبِّكَ طُغْيَانًا وَكُفْرًا. Many, living in that confusion, what happens? Many, because they're self-centered, because they're living in kufr, that type of arrogance, they would basically, when they would get the revelation, but instead it took them into طُغْيَانًا وَكُفْرًا, into more arrogance, into exceeding more limits. تأس على القوم الكافرين. Then in that situation, لا تأس. What is لا تأس? لا تأس means don't live in sorrow or pity for القوم الكافرين. But I can't help it. I feel sorry. That's part of Islam. So why is it saying فلا تأس على القوم الكافرين? فلا تأس here, not that you shouldn't be sorry for the kufr, to let it get to you, because at the end, you have to manage between you're doing da'wah to them and between letting it break you down. At the end, لست عليهم بمسيطر. You can't control whether they accept it or not. إنك لا تهدي من أحببت ولكن الله يهدي. Enforce guidance onto others. If they want guidance, they're going to take it. So at the end, it's an issue of, I guess, managing how you relate with their, do your part in delivering the message. So what about these people? What if they had really exceeded the limit? Became Satanists, became different religions. Now this again is actually coming in a form of power, because it's saying Qul, then it said, well, those that embrace Zoroastrianism or Magianism or the Christians is righteous, and those are the people. Well, they would not find fear, or face fear. We said fear of the future and sorrow of the past, or fear, perhaps, in terms of fear about their health, going to happen in the future, and the list goes on and on, because a mu'min would understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-hayy, it is immortal. He is the one that we would turn to. He is the one that's self-efficient in place and beyond time. And therefore, فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ. They would not be living in such fear, وَلَا يَؤُودُهُ حِفْظُهُمَا, because they would recognize that the preservation of all of that is not going to be hard, or is not going to be impossible. On that gives justice, He's the one that gives the care, and therefore they would turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they would surrender their Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in fear. وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. And they would not live in sorrow, because they would recognize, turn to, therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His magnificence, just as He had my matters as well. لَقَدْ أَخَذْنَا مِيثَاقَ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ وَأَرْسَلْنَا إِلَيْهِمْ رُسُلًا. We had taken upon the children of Israel il-mithaq. What is it? And we had sent prophets onto them. Every time they had received a prophet that wasn't matching what their desires wanted, a group basically had denied what was revealed. And the second, the prophets and the messengers, because to them that would go against their interests. In other words, but this is basically anybody that wants to commit kufr by committing kufr and not want to establish sharia, then in that situation, you would see, you're going to find different groups, some denying that this is wanting and using different forms of eliminating the truth, whether it's perhaps giving the justification to take away, and they don't have the right to live as human beings. We can't trial them as human beings because they are subhuman, because they're not even part of human in any way, because they're not even part human. It's all, let's dehumanize them. Let's demonize them in all these areas. And therefore, we would get them that it's justifiable, and it's justifiable to eliminate them, to kill them, to kill everyone. That is, of course, portrayed that it's all about killing, that it's all about, and of course, taking away their dreams, taking away their the right to entertainment and all of that. And therefore, it is but a form of injustice. That's the way that you would see, of course, throughout history, that the prophets and the messengers were basically targeted by trying to eliminate them entirely. وَحَسِبُوا أَلَّا تَكُونَ فِتْنَةً. To basically find. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still wanted to give them the chance to still find the opportunity for tawbah. The opportunity for tawbah groups. Oh, hold on, what happened? Okay, here we go. For those different groups, there is a possibility were basically blinded, and others were completely deaf. But the Lord Almighty is so forgiving that, well, ثُمَّ تَابَ عَلَيْهِمْ. But the Lord Almighty had basically accepted. Had others, they also, again, even though they had repented, but some still went into this time, of course, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and complete blindness. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically gives us that area where, regardless of how far they had exceeded the limit, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's door for accepting the repentance is always there. Wallahu basirun bima ya'malun. The Lord actually means He's seeing and all seeing of what they had committed, what they had done. So how's that related to all of that? Because what a person, their actions are all things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could see. They can't run away. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's forgiveness to even seeing what they would do, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's tawbah would include all, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's acceptance would include all that they had committed. قالوا إن الله هو المسيح ابن مريم وقال المسيح يا بني إسرائيل اعبدوا الله ربي وربكم إنه من يشرك بالله فقد حرم الله عليه الجنة ومأواه النار وما للظالمين من أنصار. How is that relating to the previous ayat? So remember, when we were talking about the ayat, actually talking about وَقَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ يَدُ اللَّهِ مَغْلُولَةٌ, it actually goes with the same idea. Al-Biqa'i, he basically related that this ayah is going within the same context. The context of it is that the Yahud, and what they had committed is basically a transgression in describing and speaking about the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, a transgression against the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the attributes. But then, in terms of laying the foundation of Tawheed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically describes then takes us into describing that the Christians themselves had also committed the same type of transgression where they had said and attributed al-Masih ibn Maryam, that is basically Prophet Isa alayhi salam, the son of Mary, and attributed him to basically being God himself. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know here that when he talked about the Yahud, this isn't just exclusive to the Yahud, but this would also include anybody that would confuse Tawheed, that it would go farther than just considering one group. Any group that does any particular type of kufr similar to that is basically going to be included within that transgression, and then therefore the implication is going to be an injustice of course, injustice on earth and injustice even eventually on Judgment Day. Let's see. وقال المسيح يا بني إسرائيل اعبدوا وقال المسيح يا بني إسرائيل اعبدوا الله ربي وربكم. Of course, they committed the transgression, which is that they had said that Allah is Jesus of Mary. But as a matter of fact, then this is right there, kind of shifting. وقال المسيح, as a man, al-Masih, the Messiah, had said, O children of Israel, worship the Lord Almighty, my Lord and your Lord. Why? For إِنَّهُ مَن يُشْرِكْ بِاللَّهِ فَقَدْ حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ الْجَنَّةِ. With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the Lord Almighty had basically حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ الْجَنَّةِ, had forbidden them from entering Jannah, and إِذَا لِلظَّالِمِينَ مِنْ أَنصَارٍ. And for those that had transgressed the limit and committed oppression, they would not find any victory. لقد كفر الذين قالوا إن الله ثالث ثلاثة. Those that had said that the Lord Almighty is one of the three, in other words, speaking about Trinity, they had committed kufr, they had committed disbelief. وما من إله إلا إله واحد. For there's only one Lord Almighty. وإن لم ينتهوا عما يقولون لا يمسن, and their claims, then eventually, of course, لا يمسن, they will be pricked and with the severe torments of hellfire. That is for those that would basically engage in such disbelief to the Lord Almighty and seek his forgiveness, and he is all forgiving and all merciful. ما المسيح ابن مريم إلا رسول قد خلت من قبله الرسل وأمه صديقة. The example of what only a prophet that had many prophets come before him, and his mother was a saint. They were eating food, and see how we would clarify how they would basically commit all those basically Allah had given them. Tell them, أتعبدون من دون الله ما لا يملك لكم ضرا ولا نفعا. Tell them, would you worship other than the Lord, other than Allah Almighty, who doesn't have any good, and your Lord is all hearing and all-knowing? How is that supposed to be getting us anywhere in terms of relating with the ayat before it? So the ayat before it is basically letting us know that a transgression, whether we're speaking about in understanding and defining God, or whether in the attributes of God, or whether in who God is, all of that is basically where and how we would establish our vision, how we would establish our rights and responsibilities, and how we would establish the purpose that preceded our existence. Because if we're confusing who we're worshiping, that means we're confusing the purpose and what we're heading to. If we're confusing that, then when is going to be affecting what choices we make, and certainly what foundation we would use to help us recognize, one, justice, two, the purpose that we're supposed to be heading to. So that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically tell us in regards to another type, alayhi salam, had somehow said that he had wanted them to worship him. Right there, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, well, such a blatant lie, such a claim, had announced, and he said, oh, children of Israel, worship Ubudullah, worship the Lord Almighty, my Lord and your Lord. In other words, he didn't Lord and your Lord. And whoever would associate partners of Allah with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then in that situation, they would not be granted Jannah. Now, I want you to look at, talk about their one, lays out that establishment. There's only one God worthy of worship. And if they don't end such blasphemy, then they would basically face one, could see that the ayat, أَفَلَا يَتُوبُونَ. Why would they not repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seek his forgiveness? And then it went on to say, well, Mal Masih ibn Maryam, for Prophet Isa alayhi salam, other prophets before him, his mother was a saint, Siddiqa. what is a saint anyways? Siddiqa, meaning that she was consistent with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كَانَ يَأْكُلَانِ الطَّعَامِ. They were eating like with يَأْكُلَانِ الطَّعَامِ is to tell us that there's no divinity, not in Maryam, and there's no divinity. Why? Because if they were divine, they would not have been eating. How is the food relating to anything? You would eat to gain energy, and if you needed and your life depended the food that you're eating, that means you're not the source of energy. You're not of divinity. And therefore, when the ayah said, كَانَ يَأْكُلَانِ الطَّعَامِ, that was to say, well, their life depended on something else. Then, therefore, remember that ayah, al-Hayy al-Qayyum, that's the same thing. They were not qayyumin. Their life depended on someone else giving them the provisions, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كَانَ يَأْكُلَانِ الطَّعَامَ, Lord Almighty. Of course, if they're going to be eating, that means they're going to be discreting certain things. They're going to be discharging certain things. And certainly the Lord Almighty is not a creation. The Lord Almighty is not a creature. So what I wanted to say, they were both creatures that depended, and their life depended on others. Therefore, they cannot be the creators. When you look at this, that's in order to tell us that there are certain paradigms in order to help us identify what, and based on that paradigm, you would basically relate to understanding the foundations of truth. Another paradigm. Tell them, would you worship you any harm or any power to give you good? Well, wait a minute. I thought we weren't supposed to be attributing harm to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, yes, we don't attribute harm to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of respect. But He's the one that gives life. He's the one that gives death. He's the one that also can cause and make illnesses and make it healing and give basically. He's the al-Qabid. He's al-Basit. He's power. He's the one to take it away. In other words, He's the one that controls all the different powers, all the different forces that surround you. And certainly these gods, or the attribute or claimed gods, and those that attributions that you had given to become a god because you had claimed so. Wallahu huwa as-sami'ul alim. And the Lord, and that's why it goes, قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ لَا تَغْلُوا فِي دِينِكُمْ. Having and giving love and sanctity to the Prophet, it doesn't necessarily mean that you would exceed people of the book. Don't exceed. لَا تَغْلُوا. What is al-ghulu? Al-ghulu is exceeding the limit. You can love Prophet ﷺ, you can love Muhammad ﷺ, al-bayt, but exceeding the limit and giving them the same descriptions of the Lord Almighty is going beyond. And what is it? Well, it's غير الحق. It's not the truth. And what you would end up really following, وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا أَهْوَاءَ قَوْمٍ قَدْ ضَلُّوا مِنْ قَبْلُ وَأَضَلُّوا كَثِيرًا وَضَلُّوا عَنْ سَوَاءِ السَّبِيلِ. And don't follow the whims of those that had basically deluded themselves. They're before you, and they also deluded others, and they basically were deluded and lost the place of the right path. Now, having that being said, you could see that the place of delusion usually falls within this, let's call it fanaticism, and certainly exceeding the limit, whether we're speaking about, even if it's a magnificent person like Prophet Isa alayhi salam, or Muhammad sallam, or al-Bayt, etc. That type of ghulu, fanaticism, can actually go out of what, therefore can take us out of, one, recognizing we would regard as our place of at least Sharia justice, in a place that helps us establish a foundation of truth. This is just, of course, this is really, all of this was just an introduction to the second chapter, or at least the coming chapters, let's call it that way, of Surah al-Maida, because you want to keep in mind that when we speak of a surah, yes, it's all one surah, but it kind of connects you with different together for al-Mithaq, awfu bil-uqud, and it connects you to those areas that, of course, the surah was trying to, is basically, one, founded on the visionary understanding of Allah, two, founded on holding on and being consistent with the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and here speaking of Sharia. So I want you to see right there where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, what you define as God and how you define as God is going to be affecting another implication, which basically is what you define as truth and the foundation of justice. And certainly that is either going to result in bringing about injustice if the foundation, if the beginning of it is wrong, going to be wrong. If you got the foundation basically confused that who God is, then you're not this justice. If you don't establish justice in this life, then in that situation, you're not going to get, of course, your reward you that one leads to the other, that it's founded upon. Tawheed is going to lead to Sharia. Same thing. Going to kufr or shirk is going to lead, you're going to be confusing, of course, what you're going to be applying, and it's going to result in basically self-centricity. It's going to be resulting in baghdad. It's going to be resulting in hatred, going to be resulting in injustice, and of course, it's going to be resulting in what? It's going to be resulting in hellfire. This is it. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Yeah, I just want to know what the difference between power and energy, and to see if what I understood it is like the power, Allah Himself is the power, but the energy is that Allah provided to all creation.
Right. So, I mean, when we're speaking about energy, of course, in science and physics, they have their definition of energy, but what we would mean by energy, basically, the source of power, the source of, let's say, force that creates power. Okay. So that's using it as in physics and talking about Newton and all of that. All right. But we're here talking about the foundation of force and how this basically brings about some power, and of course the implication of whatever, let's call it, momentum that is within it. So definitely we can't describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as being an energy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not an energy.
Sure.
All right. That's kufr to say. All right.
Yeah.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not an energy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the founder. He's basically the one to give different powers, to give or to even be the one to control the different powers. Whether we're speaking about life, death, rizq, different things that we might of all of that. And it's not at all like, some philosophers, they said that God surrounds us, this power, and now matter is acting on its own. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to basically be, because the ayat are telling us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the one that makes life. He's the one that gives that. He's the one. We just know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that about Himself, and we would believe it because the Lord Almighty is all about Himself, and we're not going to judge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to basically how power functions, because our knowledge about the Creator, your knowledge about creation, your knowledge about the physics in nature, those are part of the creation. Laws that you would know in physics, or the laws that you would know in nature, or impossible. To know what is possible and impossible about God, we have to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond creation.